So the first thing that I want to ask all of you individually is just to tell us a little bit about your philosophy, as I said, how energy fits into it, whether it's exclusively what you invest in or whether it's part of some of the other areas that you're focused on as a company, some of the types of companies that you've invested in, and what makes you unique? How are you different than either the other investors here on the panel or than other investors in the universe out there? Okay, so maybe Vijay, I'll start with you, and you can tell us a little bit about FWWB.
Maybe that is, FWWB is one of the oldest organizations compared to all of them. It's about 25 years old, which was part of Women's World Banking Global Network. The focus of FWWB was access to credit for women. So that was a major focus of all the affiliates of Women's World Banking. In India, we chose to add low-income household women. So we said that access to finance for low-income household women. So it's essentially the focus was availability of funds to low-income household women whom we believed that they are economically active, they play a larger role in household economy and also in the national economy because it doesn't get counted in census at all. So that was the focus which we had. We worked with about 200 organizations, so collectives of women wherever they were part of our network. And we felt that first 1 year we tried to convince the bankers, look, women are very active, they are very strong, you have to give them money, they are not covered by the banks at all. Banks never listened to us. So we set up our own credit fund, and then from that we started lending to these organizations. So the moment the credit history is created 1 or 2 years, and as a first lender, we took the kind of all the risks of a first lender, and we referred them to the banks and saying that this is how they have performed with this money. So can you give them money? So out of 200, maybe about 20 of them became much bigger. So they were very successful MFIs. So our focus has been respond to the need of the client, particularly women. That is where the energy product came. So energy loan we started giving about 8 years back. And it was in one specific region where the women said that it is important for us to have alternate energy because we live in darkness from 3 o'clock because the sun sets very early. And they are all very, that region was known for good weaving. So women indulge in weaving. So we said, okay, I also didn't know what alternate energy has to be given. And when we had a workshop, somebody came and told that we can do solar energy lantern, we can supply. We said, okay. So we asked the women to go and see the product, and they were impressed by it. And we told the supplier, we negotiated with the supplier, you have to deliver it, which is very far off from Hyderabad. You have to deliver it at the doorstep, and you should be there the next 3 months to ensure that the lanterns are working. So all these conditions he believed, and then he just accepted it, and then he did it. It's a local vendor. He produced and then did it. It was a big hit. So money came from a bank. So when we said we are going to do it, money came from a bank, and we gave the loan. And the program of the bank stopped after 2 years. They withdrew the money. So we didn't have the money to continue the program. We put our own money. Now, the solar energy, now there are lots of players which you have heard, and there are lots of products, and housing and all. Home lighting is a very sought after product. So we have raised loans from banks and also from donors.
Yes, and I want to just clarify one thing, which is that VG's organization as an apex funder is funding microfinance organizations. And for those of you who don't know the microfinance sector, VG's being very modest, but her organization seeded really the largest players in the Indian microfinance sector. So if it hadn't been for the loans that those organizations received from VG at a time when they couldn't access funding from any other financial source because they were too small or they were in too remote an area, they wouldn't have succeeded. So she really has picked the winners over time, and she was a pioneer also in lending to microfinance organizations to do energy lending. So she's in India. I mean, you're the godmother, really, in India of the sector. And that is unique. She's not saying it herself. She's being very modest, but truly that's a unique contribution to the sector. So from me and from all of them, thank you, VG. Let me pass the mic on to Miguel and tell us a little bit about investor development, energy, and what makes you unique.
So Invest Development is a seed stage focused fund. We're based out of Boston, but we have concentrations of investments in India and mostly in East Africa these days, a little bit in Latin America and some in the US. But even in the US, when we're investing, we're largely looking at investments that can go abroad and solve big problems that we see in target markets. Because we're technology investors, we're looking at the best technologies, and a lot of times you just have to go to where those are. And because of the university system here in research and the human capital, a lot of times that comes out of the US. Our investment thesis, especially around energy, we really kind of focus on two big technologies, two technology sectors: remote connectivity, so you can imagine anything kind of piggybacking on cellular technology, and now white space and broadband extension, and also on distributed energy. And the main reason we kind of picked those two areas was we were looking at sectors where technology could intervene and solve really, really significant problems for very large populations that had otherwise been shut out of the market because technology wasn't able to reach them. So in the case with energy, you look at it and say in the markets where we're most active in emerging markets, people don't want to put in $2 billion to build a big power plant that's going to take a 20-year period to repay that investment because they don't have 20 years of track record within that market that gives them the confidence to go and have that money tied up over that long period of time. But when you looked at solar technology, you saw that there was this ability to actually scale down the production of energy and get it down to the household level. So we knew that technology, the convergence of both improved battery technologies, reduced costs in inverters, and solar panels dropping in cost, we knew that those technologies were actually going to allow you to start doing distributed energy, which allows you to distribute your risk. So you could maybe still put $2 billion to work, but you're going to do it across a much larger area without any concentrated risks. And they figured that's what's going to change this. That's what's going to untrap this market. And we started looking for the most interesting companies leveraging that. Obviously, in the markets that we're at, finance is a big piece to the puzzle because even when you do something like a distributed energy technology, you're still probably going to have to provide the end user finance. There's no Best Buy cards or Visa cards really doing that, so you got to bring that part of it. So we've looked at business models that are also innovating on that side, and we found them obviously in pay-as-you-go and solar leasing models, and that's where we've been invested in so far, up to this point.
Give us a couple of examples of those companies.
Well, two of them are up here, so we're early investors both in Solar Now, that's in Uganda, that was Peter was speaking earlier, as well as Simpa Networks, and Paul was up here. And those are two, in my mind, very big pioneers of models. Simpa was one of the very first to come out and really sort of popularize pay-as-you-go financing and to go after that. And if you look at Solar Now, they were one of the very early ones to take this and say, this is really asset finance, it's microfinance plus. Why don't we start to treat it that way? And they went after and attacked the market. So for us, we looked at them both as not just pioneers of a technology, but also pioneers of business models that we still see tremendous potential and growth in. That said, we're also starting to see some areas where technology is growing. One of the things that I've always been really excited about is to see how these guys are going to build brands. Because the brands are going to be important. I think we're still looking at a lot of bumps on the road. There's a lot of, these are CDs or hybrid cars. You know that's not the solution. I think a solar home system is not the long-term solution, and I would hope that in 35 years we see very, very few of them. And I think that you're going to look at, but the guys that are installing those solar home systems now are putting They're putting wires inside of people's house, they're building brands, and they're becoming energy providers. And once you can take that out and say, what are they now? Are they going to be the world's energy financier, or are they going to be the energy company for these guys? And how they get that energy, whether it's going to come from a microgrid or a mini grid, or whether there's going to be other things that come into play there, I think is sort of irrelevant if they can own the brand, own the customer, have the customer service. And so I'm really interested to see how that's going to progress, and that's something that we're following now.
Fantastic. So Lisa, tell us a little bit about Alpha Mundi, how energy fits in, what makes Alpha Mundi unique, and maybe tell us about a couple of your investments, or if you're willing to leak them, soon to be investments.
Great. Hi, everyone. I feel like I'm going to echo a lot of what Miguel just said, so he set me up great. I work for Alpha Mundi. We're a Swiss-based impact investment firm, founded just over 5 years ago. And our investment thesis, we invest predominantly debt in SMEs in Latin America and East Africa. And the fund was started, it was seeded by one individual who was interested in debt financing and impact, but not just for microfinance. So I think at the fund level, what makes us unique is we're one of the only funds that provides working capital loans and debt financing to social enterprises that aren't just microfinance companies. So we have the belief that poverty is multidimensional, which means that we don't focus specifically on any one sector, but we think energy is a huge component of reducing poverty. So about 25% of our portfolio overall is in energy right now, and in Africa, about half of our portfolio is in energy. We see tremendous opportunity in this space, specifically in Africa and in East Africa. So not only are we growing our current debt fund, which is open-ended, we are also looking to launch an equity fund that will be, more similar along the lines to what Miguel described, that will focus on renewable energy and sustainable agriculture. And also one of the things that's exciting in the space that we're seeing as well is, the opportunities that are increasing for cross-sector collaboration. So we are part of the USAID Household Technology Guarantee Facility, so that for all of our renewable energy companies, we can apply this guarantee facility from USAID. So we're, clearly looking to grow our portfolio. I feel like Nikki wants to ask something.
Well, I want you to go into that in a little bit more depth. So I know that it's a $100 million facility, and you're one of two companies that are providing the investment. The other one is Calvert, which is really financing other apexes or other investors, whereas you're financing the companies directly. So if you can talk a little bit about what differentiates you from Calvert within that fund,
Sure.
and how the fund benefits you and how it benefits ultimately your investees.
Yeah, great. So the easiest difference is Calvert could invest in us. So, Calvert is almost like the fund of funds. So they, it makes more sense for them. Their impact can go farther, their dollars can go farther if they're investing at the fund level. For us, we're still pretty small. We have about 10 million only under management, so we're investing directly in the portfolio companies. And, sorry, what was the second question?
And how does that fund benefit you, and how does it benefit?
Got it.
Apart from you being benefited, how does it benefit the people you invest in?
Yeah, so we're still in early days of it, but I think it's hopefully going to help us raise money. So, to all you entrepreneurs in the room, we're entrepreneurs as well. We're a startup. We have to raise money before we can invest in you. We face a lot of the same challenges in terms of talent acquisition, retention. Miguel and I were just talking about bootstrapping things with interns. So, we feel what you're going through. I think having the guarantee facility, it gives us credibility as a fund. It also de-risks the investments. So I think potential investors coming into the fund love to see that, their investment is at least partially de-risked by having this guarantee over a portion of our portfolio. And we have seen that. So we had our first institutional investor come in shortly after we closed the facility in March. We have another one coming in September, and fingers crossed, another large Swiss pension fund at the end of the year. So I think, we're hitting the tipping point, which is really exciting.
Yes, and that obviously means that there's more money for all of these really interesting, innovative companies out there, but only ones that operate in Africa and Latin America.
Correct. For now.
sorry
For
for all
now.
of those.
Sorry.
Those of you who are in Asia, you're going to have to lobby in a hardcore way.
And the reason is just our bandwidth. I mean, we're 5 people. We can't cover everything. So.
Exactly. So, Greg, let me turn it over to you. Cenotaph is relatively new in the space. So, so tell us about your philosophy, how you got into energy, and what makes you unique.
Sure. So, sounds good. So I'm Greg Nietzschen. I'm the director of Kenny Arth. No offense, everybody butchers the name, and we're brand new, so no one knows how to pronounce it. So we are very different than the others on stage, in that we are not a fund or a manager or a bank or an institution. We're just a private family trying to best utilize our capital to impact big problems in the world. We take a relatively focused approach to our activity. I think we learned pretty quickly that if we were going to have a real impact on difficult value chains like energy access and like agriculture, we weren't going to do that by sitting back as armchair impact investors sitting in London or New York or San Francisco and pretending that we knew what we were doing. We were going to need to build our own real capacity to deploy capital into sectors that we learned something about. So that's what we've been doing for the past year and a half. Energy access and agriculture are our current 2 key program areas. We have a relatively flexible mandate in that we use both unrestricted personal assets as well as a private foundation to deploy philanthropically oriented assets. So our goal is really to look at these areas and say what are the gaps and how can we, with these flexible forms of capital, find gaps to take these markets to scale. In the energy access domain, I think our strategy has primarily been oriented around debt and project finance, both in the solar home system market as well as the commercial and industrial solar market. And I can get into very specifics with that, but I'd say our activity below that, so if you sort of double click down, is both direct investing. So as a lender directly to some of the solar home companies that are distributing, for example, we're the primary lender to B-Box, which is solar home system vendor in Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda. And we have a whole set of other sort of deals in the queue. And then we're also trying to catalyze new intermediaries in that market because we recognize that as a single family office, certainly we alone are not going to solve the problem. So one of our investments is in the audience today, Lendable. And there's a few other intermediaries that we're working with as well.
So at the risk of sort of getting too deep into your private discussions amongst yourselves, what were some of the gaps that you thought that you could fill, that you felt that other investors weren't filling? And I know Vince and Harry from your team, who I think are very smart, interesting and interested characters. So I would just have loved to have been a fly on the wall where you were having those gap discussions. But if you're willing to share, I think everyone would be very interested to hear.
Yeah, I think that I think one thing we tried to do at the beginning was really not to drive that gap discussion based on our own sort of pontificating about how the energy access market was going to be solved. I think we tried to have as many conversations as we could with real practitioners and real investors who've been doing this for a heck of a lot longer than we had. So, Miguel and others in this room, we sort of talked to in that process of how do we form a real opinion on what those gaps are. And I think we, consistently heard, as actually Miguel just said, that, access to customer financing to accelerate the deployment of many of these pay-as-you-go models and lease models was a big gap. It happened to align with how we sort of temperamentally orient ourselves as investors, in that we like to root ourselves to cash flows. So debt and project finance just happened to be something we gravitated to in that gap discussion. It's certainly not the only gap. And I think that there are multiple other pieces of the sort of value chain and of the infrastructure chain that need to be solved. This just happens to be the one that we're trying to build, some expertise and momentum on right now.
Fantastic, thank you. And I want to pick up on something that came up in the last panel, where I think we were all quite moved to hear how each of the panelists talked about the importance of providing a platform for connecting emotionally, for finding a way to channel emotion from people in the diaspora, channeling their emotions so that they would be able to invest in their families back home. So, investors aren't known to be particularly emotional types, and do they actually have souls? So to tap into whether you have souls, I want to know what moves you guys emotionally. What moves you? What is the emotion that's there when you're making these investment decisions, or is it purely a rational, rational kind of exercise for you? Vijay, maybe let's start with you.
I'm emotional, but I wish I spent more time with investors, but I have the task of convincing our bankers to get involved in that. And I find there is a kind of a stone wall. They are not emotional like the way I wanted them to be. But keeping on telling them the stories of my field experience, where I feel there are lots of problems because of lack of power, energy that is available, and then the ability for them to earn more, how get restricted because their access to energy is not there. I keep on telling stories, and then I managed to move 2 bankers in last 2 years. And I'm sure that once you move one person, it becomes much more easy. But bankers are tough nuts to crack. But since all of us who are in the field are charged by the kind of a fix the people, rural people particularly are in, then you are able to pitch in much better. So I think that the emotional quotient works, but I wish it worked like what Mayuk and all were telling the previous panel. It worked wonderfully. Maybe we were barking at the wrong tree, but I have a sneaky feeling that once the bankers move, then there is a big door opens for the energy loan, because they are the ones who are sitting over lots of money, and it's a long-term solution for any country that needs money. So I don't feel that it's a waste of time, but I feel that on emotional quotient only I can convince them to get into energy loan. So I have lots of stories, because you keep traveling in the field and then you realize how much they are restrained. So, but what solar lamps or lanterns you have given had made a kind of impact. So you quantify all those things and tell them that it becomes easy to convince. But I still feel it's a very small effort we have put in. There is so much work that has to be done.
Have to crack the souls of bankers. But Greg,
So
Greg.
I'll take, I think I'll take a slightly sort of contrary position about sort of cracking the souls of bankers. I mean, I guess as a family office, we are in these markets because they have big impact. And I think, we start from sort of the core thesis that if you have more capital than you need to live reasonably comfortably, then you should be using that capital to sort of solve problems in the world. So I think obviously that is a emotionally driven decision in some way, although I think in some ways we would just sort of say that's a pragmatic decision. I think beyond that, emotion is creating a lot of problems in the impact investment world. And I would say that if you are going to make a real investment decision based on getting teary-eyed, seeing a solar panel on a village on a PowerPoint slide, it may make you a mediocre philanthropist. It'll make you a bad investor. And so I think that what we need is more in the way of sophisticated, investment decisions, obviously driven by the realities of the markets and obviously driven by the realities of what's happening on the ground. But I think there's a lot of, concessionary and sort of an emotionally driven money that's entering these markets that actually just leads to bad deals. And it leads to companies structuring themselves in funky ways, and it leads to the wrong incentives. And so I think we feel as if people should be driven to deploy capital in these ways, but should do that in a sophisticated and commercial and rigorous manner.
So Miguel, what's your take?
So I'm Latin, and I grew up in a Latin family, so there's like no shortage of emotion, right? And you can go watch a soccer game. So for that part of it, it was always easy. I grew up back and forth between Texas and Bolivia. So in Bolivia, it's a very poor country. It's sort of the Africa of Latin America. So we had the context, and I sort of saw the disparity growing up the whole life. So I've always had a bit of a bend towards wanting to solve some of these problems that to me seemed unfair. And by just like anything else, an engineer looks at something and says, why is this inefficient? I got to find the efficiency in it. I sort of had that same drive because I saw that this unfairness was actually an inefficiency within a system, and I wanted to go find that efficiency. That said, I mean, you're working on problems, and when you work on problems, you go out and you meet people. You see the people that are going to eventually benefit from this, or who are currently, not benefiting from one of these systems. You read a lot of literature. And you dive in really deep, and that heady part, that to me drives a lot of emotional charge, because I'm just not somebody who wants to sit on the sidelines from anything. And so, you get this and you start to look at these problems and you see them and you know that they're going to be growing problems, and you can go talk to other people about it, and they're not going to get as excited about it as you are. And so that just charges the emotions to go and try to act on that more and say, if we have this knowledge or we have this ability to affect this change, we have to go do it. And it becomes a being compelled. That said, as an investor, and I used to do lending, and in debt, the margin for error is zero. So when you're doing debt, you have to get very rigorous about it. So there's that other part of it, of just getting back, sitting in front of your computer and seeing that spreadsheet and forgetting what's behind it, and forgetting that there's these things. And we used to say, when we were looking at co-investors, we could look at their websites, or we could look at their profile pictures on LinkedIn or Facebook, and we could always tell, are they making an emotional investment, or are they making a rational investment? Because we wanted to know, if we're going to go in and co-invest with somebody, am I going to actually use your due diligence, or am I going to do all my own, because I think you're going to be biased on it? And so that emotional bias that can come in, you have to keep it in check. I don't think we have it, but we're always going to try to keep it in check. I think that's an important part about it.
I don't think I can add much. I agree with everything you guys have said. I certainly personally am probably criticized for being too emotional. So I think it's a bigger challenge for me to sit behind the spreadsheet and actually, make the right investment decision, which I actually had to do just 2 days ago. But I mean, you work with these companies, you get to know them, you get to know the entrepreneurs, you get to know their families, you get to know all the beneficiaries, and it's hard. I mean, you really, really care. I just moved back to the U.S. and I'm transitioning some of my responsibilities over to our investment manager in Nairobi, and I cover Africa, and I feel like I'm letting go of my children. I'm like, but I mean, I don't have anything new to add.
And the only thing,
go ahead.
yeah, no, the only thing I was going to add is in some ways, it's really trying to figure out what is best for the long-term sustainability of these businesses. So, I'm not, trying to be the unemotional, cold person on the panel. In fact, I think everyone's in this room we're all sort of in these markets because we care about these problems and want to solve these problems. To me, that's sort of the bar. Then it becomes, what does it take to solve these problems? What does it take to get these companies from, being able to deploy $5 million of customer finance or $10 million of customer finance to deploying hundreds of millions of dollars of customer finance? And, while we may be able to make some, emotionally connected decisions now, unlocking hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of there's not enough emotionally driven capital in the world to solve the scale of the problems we're trying to solve.
Exactly. And I set you up a bit, of course, in the way I asked the question, but I think the point you're making, Greg, is really, really important. And I think that that the issue you raise, how do you balance the fact that it's something that there's a deep need there, which does touch our hearts, with the fact that you are responsible for other people's money. In your case, you're responsible for, it's a family foundation, you're a fiduciary for someone else's money, and that person wants that money invested in a responsible and responsive way, and there's a balancing act that's involved in that. And so, what are some of the considerations that you have, or some of the constraints that you're operating under that perhaps an investee wouldn't understand, because they just want your money, whereas you're trying to make a set of decisions around a portfolio that actually comes from another place where you're beholden to other people. So maybe speak to that a little bit. Lisa, do you want to
I
start?
can take the first step. I mean, there's a lot of checks and balances built in, right? So, I mean, we have our hierarchy within Alpha Mundi, investment analyst, manager, Tim, me. But we have an investment committee, we have a risk committee, we have a board. And the jobs of these people are to make sure that we're not getting too emotional and too involved, and make sure that we're making sound investment decisions, make sure that we are taking our fiduciary responsibility seriously. We have to monitor and report on all of these things. The governance structure of the organization, I think, is very important to have these checks in place. So that and we've had it many times, where I feel like you get very involved in an investment, and we have monthly investment committee calls, and they don't know, they haven't seen the beneficiaries, they don't know the entrepreneurs, and they ask very hard questions. And so structuring our committee, our board, and that governance, I think, is hugely important.
I don't have that benefit, actually. So a lot of the decisions actually in the end get made by me, and a lot of times in a black little box. So to me, it's just the drive and the responsibility to keep up with it. I built really good relationships with all the entrepreneurs and in the rooms, and they can tell you about it. I mean, I feel a lot of commitment to them in a lot of ways, but also I'm fiduciary for the money, and so I'll never make a bad investment. Everything that comes back in, I have to go back and make sure that we've done our best. That doesn't mean you won't walk away from investment. Sometimes you do, but sometimes you're going to walk away from that investment, and it's going to be that hard part. And I'll tell you, probably the hardest decision I've had to make. I had an entrepreneur that wasn't achieving the milestones. The investment wasn't going in the way it was supposed to go. Great entrepreneur, but hectic. And he they needed more money. I wasn't going to release them more money. They had a fire in the house, and the house burned down. Now, this is an entrepreneur who had done everything in the world to keep his daughter, who he had partial custody over, in a large part because he had a home, and so he was able to maintain that partial custody. But when he lost his home, he was going to lose partial custody, and he needed money for to pay the insurance premium, not the premium, but the copay, so that he could get his house rebuilt. And of course, there was no money in the company. There was all of this, and so I took him aside and I said, okay, I'm going to pay you as a contractor. It's not an investment. I'm going to pay you out of my pocket to do some work for me, and I want you to go do this work, and it'll cover your premium and get that. And I said, but on one condition. And this is a founder-only driven company. It's very much a personality-driven company at the early stage. I said, the one condition is that you quit. You walk away and you get a job. He had worked at Microsoft in the past. This is an African-born, came to the U.S. postgraduate, did graduate work, and worked his way up into Microsoft. And so I said, go back and go get a job and take care of yourself, get your family back on track, and all that kind of stuff. And you come back. And he said, yeah, absolutely, I'm going to do it. And he took the money and disappeared. Calls me up 6 months later, and he says, okay, now I know you're going to kill me, and I know I didn't quit, but let me tell you about how much money we're making today. And right now, I think they're at 30 million revenue top line. So, he turned it around, and he actually did it. And my decision, to tell him to walk away was actually the wrong one. He was actually right in kind of getting it. But the emotional side of me was saying, okay, I can't release more money. I couldn't make that decision. I couldn't follow on the investment and just bail them out. That was my fiduciary responsibility. But my emotional part was, I'll take money out of my pocket to get you straight, and then go get out of here and go do something else. I'm willing to take the first loss. That part we can kind of chalk up. But that's where you get in this industry. And a lot of times, I don't think people realize how hard on our part of it that can be, that we have the relationships both with the entrepreneurs and as well as our fiduciary responsibility to our investors.
Fiji, let me take it to you have a different kind of a structure perhaps than some of the other organizations. What are some of the constraints that you're dealing with given your structure in India?
As a wholesale lender, now
yes.
it becomes slightly difficult to raise funds at the beginning. So we have a strategy of mobilizing funds from private sector, particularly grant, and combining with what we are getting from banks. But 80 to 85% of the fund we have mobilized for all the activities, whether it is energy or whether it is for working with groups, small and marginal farmers, or in solar water and sanitation is coming from banks. So, that puts the pressure on you. So you have to pay the money on time to them to keep your records straight. So if there is a delay from your partner organization, that you cannot wait for it. So that emotional thing you set aside and they shout at them over the phone and then get the money. But the constraint is there is a huge demand. Raising sufficient money that can take care of the demand is still a big challenge. When India, energy particularly, it's a very startup stage. It's on a very small scale. But I can see, because since I was associated with microfinance, it happened to microfinance also 20 years back. But now you see the way the bankers are falling over each other and giving money. But creating that in energy sector is going to take some time. So the constraint is saying no. When genuine people wants to have access to finance, then you get frustrated because you don't have money. And another constraint we have is underdeveloped and then unreachable areas where these services are very critical. Reaching these products is much difficult for us. Very remote. So it becomes very difficult for you to reach it out. And also for the suppliers, it doesn't make any economic sense. Like we insist that you have to also provide after-sales service for some time so that the customer is comfortable with the product. So for them, it's very expensive to provide the service in a remote area. So that is one of the problems which we have. But I wish that we'll crack it and then raise more money. Otherwise, the problem is money.
Yeah. You and I have talked at different points about one other challenge or constraint, which is the capacity of some of the institutions to do that work. So there are a number of microfinance organizations in India that would love to have money from you or from someone else to do energy lending, but the capacity isn't there. How do you deal with that constraint? What are some of the tactics you've used, or how do you handle that?
Essentially, we started with non-profits, which are providing financial services. They had a kind of maybe bigger heart, so where they felt that they have to deal with lots of other issues that are related to the constituency of theirs. So there, the introducing energy project or sanitation loan and all, it became much more successful. Bigger the size of the MFIs, it became a challenge for us to convince them to do the energy loan. And we also have lots of regulatory restrictions, because in India, Reserve Bank defines that 85% of your money has to go for income generating activity. So that qualifying assets 85% means there is no incentive for MFIs to cram this loan under 15%. It becomes very difficult for them to take it. So we don't chase the big MFIs. We just start working with the unregulated MFIs that are working in remote areas and doing it. But then loan intake is very low in that organization, because they have 5,000 farmer households or 10,000 households covered. So number-wise, it's fine, but we are not worried about it. But training the staff in distinguishing that this is not the cutting microfinance product, this is an energy product. So you have to be there, and then you have to spend time with the customer to tell them that this is how the product works. You cannot misuse it. All the problem that I think Chris was narrating yesterday in the DC, those problems you have to resolve. So it's a specialized set of people who should interact with the customers. And that training goes from us. So we have to tell them that you have to be sensitive.
Greg, are there any constraints or challenges either that you face or that you see that your investees face that are worth sharing in this context?
Well, our investees have all sorts of all sorts of constraints and challenges that we could spend a lot of time on. I think on our side as a family office, as silly as it might sound, our biggest constraint and challenge at the beginning was that we had no constraints. And actually, while that sounds like a blessing and a privilege, if you're trying to do things in a rigorous and sophisticated way, it actually becomes a big problem. So I think that we pretty quickly recognized that that being able to focus on specific areas and specific types of transactions, sort of creating self-limiting constraints, actually allowed us to do our work better. I think that I think on our investee side, in terms of challenges, financial acumen and financial immaturity of many of the companies is one of the biggest constraints I see to more capital flowing into these markets. It's often that from an operational perspective and from a business perspective, people have reasonable businesses and actually are generating some cash and could be able to pay back debt and take on debt. But oftentimes they're such a mess from a financial management perspective that it's hard for them to articulate to a professional investor, how do I look at your income statement or your balance sheet to make sense of this so that I can responsibly lend to you? And I think that kind of capacity building is really important in the industry so that professional investors can make good decisions.
And do you, in your case, do you do that capacity building yourself, or do you work with other organizations to provide that kind of service for you?
We work with other organizations in general. We too have a relationship with USAID, where we're hoping to leverage some of their capacity building and technical assistance. There are others that are actually better grant makers than us. I think in learning about what we're good at and trying to stick to what we're good, we're not that, our orientation is not to be a really good grant maker. I think there are some fabulous grant makers, so we've tried to partner with those kinds of organizations where they're looking to see their grants get leveraged. And so in cases where their technical assistance grants leads to an investor like us saying, look, if their financial house is in order, then someone like us is going to come in and make these investments. Sometimes that's a really good partnership, and we're trying to find those.
Okay, fantastic. And I have just one last question for all of you, and whoever wants to jump in first, please feel free to. And, what excites you? What's exciting that's happening out there, either from an investment point of view, either technology that excites you, or business models that excite you, or people that excite you? What's exciting out there at the moment? Whoever wants to go first that you're seeing.
I think actually the debt capital that's been coming in, the discipline that's been coming in, I think when I got started in this sector, there was a lot less discipline on the financial side. And so I was really worried about the scalability of it. And, I had worked in microfinance and I saw some of the early days of microfinance, but I came into microfinance when it was already starting to get sophisticated and watched it just take off because of that. And I was worried that in impact investing, we were going to have to wait 30 years as well. And I think that we're not. I think actually we're seeing the accelerating pace of that happening where we're getting really good, strong, sophisticated investors in, and we're starting to see those companies scale. It might just be a bias in my portfolio because I've got, we started in 09 and really started making investments in 10. And the stage of those companies now are scaling up. And you're seeing a lot more money come in. It's money of all different ilks. It's not just impact investors. That bit to me is a lot more exciting, I think, than I anticipated it being at this stage.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot, actually. I think, I've been in this space now for 6 years, and, I do think you're starting to see a lot more financial players come to the stage. I think you're seeing a lot more. It's still a lot of talk, but starting to do around just innovative financing mechanisms. I mean, I think what USAID is doing is wonderful, not just with the household technology facility, but they're doing some other programs, around technical assistance and how can you leverage capital in different ways to do more good as opposed to just giving grants at a small scale. So I think that's exciting. And then, everything we're seeing with technology in the energy space and the intersection of energy and ag and energy and mobile payments. And, it's almost more challenging for an investor because now you are seeing so many companies spring up. But at the same time, there's such a huge underserved market still out there. So I think, we're going to see tremendous growth in the off-grid space that we're active in, especially in the next few years.
I'm in the sector for 20 years because it excites me to see the kind of change that I see in the field. Like you can see the women have changed, and then the investment they are making in the next generation has changed, and there is so much improvement in their lifestyle. Still, there is a big gap. So that's what worries you a lot. But excitement is like solar lamp. If you see, we have seen the income level has gone up 3 times every month. So they will tell us also, thanks for this. And then if you walk into and then say that, they will know that this lamp was provided by it, and then they will tell you. And children's education has improved a lot. So you can see the impact on the next generation on that. That's what excites you. Your help may be small, and you are giving a loan. You are not giving anything, and then you are charging a fee for that. But still, it has made a kind of impact. That's what. And also, it makes you feel that you have to keep finding solution for lots of other problems. So you just solved one, there is something else comes up. Now food security is something that we are working on. So when you are doing it, then you know that, okay, you derive the kind of a strength seeing the impact of one program, and then you want to deal with the other one. I think it's very exciting when you see the impact of your intervention. That's what makes me excited. Right?
I mean, it excites me to listen to that and to listen to someone who spent 20 years, you know, with this level of tenacity to solve problems in people's lives. I mean, that's exciting. The fact that I get to this privilege, that to me is exciting. What I was going to say was it's exciting to me when I log into our accounts and I see money coming back to us. Because I think that means that this is all working, and it's not money that's small. It's, you know, fairly large, substantial deals that, you know, money is back in our accounts, and I think that means that that this works as a sustainable industry and it can move towards scale.
Fantastic.